CO2 emissions are leading to the climate change that is happening all around us. Almost all of us are affected in some way or the other. We read about climate change as headlines very regularly in newspapers. It's affecting our travel schedules. It's affecting our grocery bills because of vast devastations in agricultural output, because of untimely rains, or because of no rains, drought, or excessive rains, right? And somehow we don't take any action against it, right? Did you know that the built environment, the infrastructure that we build, contributes to 40% of all the CO2 emissions? And therefore, it has a very, very big impact on climate change. In India, our buildings consume 30% of all the electricity and 50% of all our energy. Buildings once built last for 50 to 100 years, right? So if designed wrongly or inefficiently, we will pay the price for it for the next 50 to 100 years. It's high time that all of us engage in our decision making, right? The next time we buy a house, or we rent one, or we give specifications for a built-to-suit building, that we engage with our designers, with the developers in these conversations, where we specify the efficiency for energy, water, and waste, right? We should use our collective buying power to drive change at a massive scale. One such company, Infosys, decided they will really be unreasonable and reduce their carbon footprint by a factor of 2. Infosys 10 years ago was adding 20,000 new employees per year, and they were adding 20 lakh or 2 million square feet of new built space every year. And they realized the impact of their built environment on the climate change. So what do they do first? They set up an extensive monitoring system. They metered and measured every building of Infosys. They also started sub-metering and measuring all their major equipments, right? And as a result of this rich data that they were gathering, they realized how energy was being wasted at nights and how energy was spent in machines all around their campuses. They collected this huge data set and created a set of goals for their consultants, for their new projects. Remember, they were adding 20,000 new employees and 2 million new square feet every year. So what are the kind of goals, right? And why it's necessary to be unreasonable, right? So they took on goals saying that the heat load coming from a facade should reduce by a factor 4, right? The lighting use should come down by a factor 4. Now, you might wonder that, these glass buildings that they were designing, why do they need so much lighting, right? But it was causing so much glare that people put the blinds down and they had to use artificial lights all the time, right? Motors, they had documented that the motors were consuming maximum amount of energy at Infosys. And the highest amount of energy was in HVAC systems. And so for both of them, they had a factor 2 reduction target. Now, of course, when they socialized this with their consultants, the first reaction was, this is impossible. Are you suggesting that we are designing such poor buildings that you can do a factor 4, factor 2 kind of reduction? And what Infosys did is, because they thought that these guys are not taking them seriously, decided to link their fees with the performance criteria, saying if you don't deliver on these performance numbers, we won't pay you your fees. At that point, everybody woke up and started taking it very, very seriously. And were they successful? Well, let's see. So buildings which were very high-tech looking, but very uncomfortable for the occupants inside, suddenly changed, right? The window wall ratio from being 100% glass went down to 40 to 30%, right? Architects started specifying insulation on our buildings. Earlier it was thought that insulation is only necessary for cold climates, but insulation works both ways, right? It doesn't let the heat come in. And so what they saw is they started using super windows. Now, windows and glass traps heat, right? And so you have to use it very judiciously, especially in a warm and tropical climate like India. And there was a dramatic change. The heat gain into these buildings came down from 4 watts a square foot to 0.5 watts a square foot. That's an 8x reduction, which was possible only because they stood the ground and started demanding very unreasonable goals. But this was very simple to achieve. It wasn't unreasonable in hindsight, right? Next, the goal was that how do you reduce your lighting energy by 4x, right? And so what was happening is that these deep, very deep buildings started becoming very skinny. And architects were very innovative. They did a lot of research, they did a lot of simulation, and they realized that if they can reduce the floor plan of each wing to a maximum of 16 meters or 50 feet, they could ensure that 90% of the floor space was completely daylit. Now, if you sit in a daylit environment, it really helps you, and it can actually increase 45 to 50 minutes of additional sleep during a day, in the nights, sorry. So designing such buildings meant that now you were exposed to daylight and didn't have to use electricity in the daytime, right? And additional electricity used for lighting also introduces heat. So then the heat loads also came down. But then what about glare? How do you control glare? And again, a lot of research and experimentation led to this idea of introducing a light shelf at a height of 1/3 from the top of the glass, which bounces the light much deeper into the space and ensures that the entire floor is lit. But the light shelf also ensures that there is no glare. It shades the glass and ensures that there is no glare coming into the eyes of people who are sitting right next to the windows, right? So the new buildings at Infosys had no blinds. And people could therefore look, even though they had glass buildings earlier, they could not look outside. And now in these buildings, they had access to beautiful campus views all through the day. Motors, and in turn pumps and fans, consume 60% of all the energy in the world. 60%. And so Infosys took a target that how can we reduce that by a factor 2? Now, if you see that in most of the plant rooms, there are lots of pipes, all with 90-degree bends, right? What we are trying to do is we are pumping water, goes to a 90-degree bend, through friction loses some of the energy, and then gets diverted, right? So one of our brilliant engineers from Singapore, Mr. Lee Anglock, took inspiration from the human heart, right? He studied the human heart and found out that the human heart can pump 100,000 kilometers through our body, through the blood vessels, and consumes only 1.5 watt of energy per GPM. Whereas those chiller plants that we were designing were consuming 15 watts of energy per GPM. As a result, he decided to eliminate 90-degree bends. If you wanted to achieve 90 degrees, it was 2 45-degree bends. And what really resulted was more than a 2x reduction in this. Imagine if this idea can be taken by all industries across the world, what a massive change we can drive. And the next level, the next target that we had given was reducing the HVAC energy by a factor 2, right? Now, why do we need air conditioning? It's for comfort. So we started researching what is comfort for somebody, right? Because of metabolism, our body temperature, internal body temperature is at 37 and our skin is at 34. But what is your comfort level? It's about 24, right? In that range. So if you want to be comfortable, you always have to give away heat. Now when you explore how does the human body really give away heat, physics has really taught us that heat is given up by either conduction, convection, or radiation. And we know that the radiation is the fastest way of giving away heat. The sun's radiation reaches you in 8 minutes, and convection is the slowest, right? In chemistry, school chemistry, we've learned that between solid, liquid, and gas, the gas molecules are far apart and is the least efficient in terms of heat transfer. right? But what does air conditioning use? Air conditioning uses air, which is gas, and it uses convection. So both according to physics and chemistry, in terms of heat transfer, air conditioning is the least efficient, but is the most prevalent, right? So it kind of baffled us. And all of you have actually visited, some of these places. You've gone to palaces, you've gone to monuments, you've gone to caves, and haven't you experienced that it's really nice and cool? But there is no electricity there, so there is no air conditioning. So what is this mechanism, right? And when you dive down deeper, you realize that these walls or these monuments or these caves are much cooler than your body. And the way your body is giving away heat is by radiation to these surroundings, and therefore you feel nice and cool. 45% to 50% of how the human body gives away heat is by radiation, and we were not exploiting that fact. So what Infosys had decided to do was to work on how we can do this, right? They put water pipes inside the slab during construction and started passing cool water. What that did was exactly like a cave or monument. It cooled down the slab, the concrete, and then people were able to radiate to the cooler slab and feel nice and comfortable. Extensive studies at Infosys with the help of University of Berkeley revealed that this cooling was far more comfortable. There were no hot spots because engineering an air conditioning system requires a lot of effort. It's an art to ensure that there are no hot spots in the whole room. Whereas I can radiate with my line of sight to any part in the room and feel nice and cool. And so this became the norm. And the next 50 lakh square feet or 5 million square feet of buildings were done with this new technology called radiant cooling. This is a big idea and has to be exploited if we really want, because today in urban India, as people aspire to start using air conditioning in their homes, 50% of all our electricity in urban cities is going in air conditioning. And so we have to innovate and we have to think differently on how we are going to cool our future buildings, right? And these are the kind of pipes that are put inside the slabs. So Infosys achieved its goal of 2x, and the reason for this is because now you are transporting heat from your room to the exterior using water, and water is 3,400 times more efficient in transporting heat than air. And also you are using a much higher temperature waters to cool the slab as opposed to air conditioning. And so as a combination of these two, the energy reduction was more than 50%. Now, how do you prove that to the world, and how does the world adopt this, right? So what Infosys did in its first experimental building, they took a building in two halves. The left half was air conditioned and the right half was radiant cool, right? And the last 7 years of data shows that the right half is more than 50% more efficient and far more comfortable than the air conditioned side, right? So in God we trust, everybody else brings data, was what Narayana Murthy kept telling all of us. And he wanted data to prove to the rest of the world that this is possible, right? Now what we have is we have scientists from all over the world coming here to study and experience this so that they can start implementing and recommending it in their buildings. The next important thing is really to have control, okay? Monitor and control is really, really important. In this new IoT age, if you can monitor and manage all your assets really well, then you can operate them at the most optimum level. And that itself can lead to an additional 10 to 15% savings, maybe even more. I have done audits of a lot of projects and I've realized that, just by operating the system at its designed levels, you can actually improve by a factor of 20-25%. And in terms of comfort, the next big thing that is happening now is passing on the controls in the hands of the users, right? Today we put a sensor to tell us, how cold it is or how warm it is, and we put a cutoff saying that if it touches 24 degrees, cut it off. What if the sensor doesn't work, right? The best sensor is our human skin. our human body. We know whether if we feel hot, cold, less or more. And so if we can actually on our mobile phone can adjust it instead of using another sensor, we can really operate that system at its very optimal level. And I see this trend happening more and more where user control is going to take over from sensors. So how does all these learnings, right, help? I mean, none of this can actually work, and it cannot be, it won't work unless it is sustained by profits, right? And so was this whole journey at Infosys profitable? Well, what happened is that the lesser heat gain, right? For lesser heat gain, they used super insulated buildings, very high performing windows, all of that. So that increased costs. But what also happened is that they were able to reduce the cost of their equipments. The mechanical equipments came down dramatically, which is the chillers, pumps, cooling towers, AHUs. The size of all of those equipments came down dramatically. The connected load, electrical load came down dramatically. So the size of the DG sets, the transformers, the cables came down dramatically. Because these two came down, the size of the utility building came down dramatically, right? So all of this, the reduction in these costs, the MEP costs, was far more than the cost they invested in making the buildings more efficient. So in the end, Infosys was able to save 5% in capital costs and 50% in operating costs. So can we not take this learning from this one company over the last 10 years, extremely well documented, and take these learnings to all over the world? We tried that very hard. We published all this information on the internet, but there are very few takers. There are very, very few takers. All the success stories of Infosys of having grown their employee strength by 120%, at the same time the energy grew by only 13%. They saved $100 million in operating costs in 8 years, right? None of this really made a big dent in developers in our country. And so my one formula of really making change, driving change at scale, is to incentivize the developers dramatically. If you give them a 25% additional profit, what will happen? Overnight, they'll do a PhD in green buildings, right? And that will not just give them profits, but the tenants who are occupying these buildings will pay 50% less in their electricity bills. And electricity bills constitute about 25% of the rent, right? Everybody around them will go because you will consume less resources. So it's a benefit, it's a win-win-win situation for the developers, tenants, community, and the world in general. And this, I think, is really important, that we all collectively start demanding action and driving change. It's our individual choices that can really drive change. Thank you.